just talking about the taking out of Haniyeh, who was the chief negotiator, if you like, for this path to peace, and the reaction from the Biden administration that they were livid that he was taken out. Let me get your take on it. What are your views?
Well, first of all, I don't think he was that responsible in terms of the negotiations. I think he was helping facilitating that process. But I think, as we've even beforehand, the buck really stopped with the Hamas leadership inside Gaza, and primarily with Sinwar. And as we've now seen the announcement in the last 24 hours that Sinwar is not only remaining in charge of the faction inside Gaza, but of the overall operation and replacing him, I think that's more proof of that he's really the one calling the shots.
But in terms of taking out the optics on it, if he was at least part of the peace negotiation, why do you think they took him out?
It's a good question. I mean, first of all, Israel formally hasn't taken responsibility, so we're in the kind of, it's the assumption, but I'm sure that we all share. I think since October the 7th, I think the Israelis have said that all the Hamas leadership are marked men, as it were, and an opportunity, an operation opportunity, presented itself, which they took. I don't think that would be my kind of my reading of it on face value.
Okay, George?
Well, I think Richard probably sums it up rather well. I mean, I think Israel's mode is just simply to target all Hamas leaders. The problem is, of course, that doesn't really address the problem. I mean, even if you wiped out Sinwar and the rest of the Hamas leaders, there are going to be other leaders to take their place. So that's why essentially the policy of targeted assassinations is actually of very limited utility, because there's always somebody else ready to take his place, and that's why states generally don't do it. They fight wars, try to win wars, and resolve issues through peace negotiations. But taking out the leaders of your opponents is really quite a pointless activity.
Martin?
Pointless, and I think one which may well backfire on Israel. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it. I don't think you can say on the one hand, look, this guy wasn't that important, but he was a sitting duck in Iran, and we had some double agents inside, working for the Iranian Guard who helped two ladies. It was a very, very detailed, precise, very well executed operation as far as assassinations go. But I think it's going to be very, very hard now for Israel to face the international community and keep a straight face and say we're happy to carry on talking about the possibility of a peace process when there is no peace process. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that Israel was not interested in a two-state solution. Israel is not interested in stopping its killing, its murdering of women and children at this incredible rate. And I think it's just rank hypocrisy to talk about such things in a certain light. Either the guy was important and relevant and worth assassinating, or he wasn't. I'm not sure I swallow completely the explanation of that.
Well, I mean, he certainly was. He was the leader of Hamas, and he was basically recognized by a number of people as key to the negotiations for peace. Richard, I'll let you come back on that. What are your takes on what Martin and George have to say?
Oh, I mean, first of all, I'd make a distinction. I don't think these weren't peace talks. These are talks to reach a hostage release and a ceasefire. Very specific technical framework. I mean, we can talk broadly if we want to talk about peace process. Unfortunately, that's nowhere near. But Hamas weren't anywhere on the cards in terms of a real peace process, and I think
you're splitting hairs. I think you know perfectly well. I meant a ceasefire, obviously not peace talks for a complete solution of the Middle East. I mean, I was referring to a ceasefire, and I stand by my point. I can't see how Israel can now keep a straight face and say it's committed to any sort of ceasefire when it's carrying out these assassinations. There are lots of blocks and potential problems to reach a ceasefire, and I think the part of the issue as well is that
whether Israel just doesn't see Hamas as a partner at all. The very fact that these talks are presuming that there will be stages 2 and 3 that will see Hamas remain in some form of control is incredibly problematic, not just for Israel, but for the international community and for the goodwill that looks to rebuild Gaza the day after. No one is going to want to invest in Gaza whilst Hamas is still in control there. So it's we're really caught in a very difficult and dangerous dilemma as there's no obvious way forward there.
You mentioned part of your role, Richard, is obviously to assist people's understanding of Israel and its position. Now, my understanding from talking to a number of people and reading various publications is that a lot of people in Israel don't support Netanyahu's approach. What's the truth?
Absolutely. Listen, Israel is quite divided right now. The Netanyahu, to an extent, is a litmus test that he still has a section of support. I bear in mind that even those that are kind of, because of the Israeli electoral system, Netanyahu is in power thanks to about 25% of the support, and that number has been pretty consistent throughout his time as prime minister. And then his reliance on coalition partners. This time round, those coalition partners are of the hard right and the ultra orthodox that are bringing together, that have a vested interest in seeing Netanyahu remain in power. And just like the IDF themselves are rehabilitating their image within Israeli society following the failure of October the 7th, similarly, Netanyahu is also trying to rehabilitate his own image as a leader, and as he potentially looks to fight the next election. But you're absolutely right. There is at least 50% of the country that is vehemently against him, that is kind of is of a much more, I would say, a liberal democratic hue, and that sees a different way forward, and sees Netanyahu for his collective almost decade and a half in power as ultimately responsible for the failures on October the 7th, and so he must go. But as a functioning democracy, albeit with its problems and challenges, that will be left to the electorate eventually.
Yeah, and I think it's so important in this discussion, as I say, we always like to shine more light and less heat on this, because so many people, they just assume that everybody's behind Netanyahu, and as you rightly say, that's not the case at all. George, what's your thought?
Well, I'd be interested to find out from Richard that, okay, so let's say 50% of the population does not support Netanyahu, but from what I've understood from the opinion poll surveys, they may not like him, they may not like his government, but they do support his war aims, and they do support his pursuit of the war to the finish. In other words, that ultimate nebulous goal of destroying Hamas, which seems to be a very, very difficult and a dubious exercise. So I want to know from Richard, so when you say 50% don't support Netanyahu, don't like Netanyahu, that's a given. But what's the percentage of the population that would now settle for a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities now, today?
Richard?
So I'll just give an example. I mean, if you go to Tel Aviv on a Saturday night, you see 3 protests happening kind of on parallel streets simultaneously. One is calling for the release of the hostages, the other is calling for an end of the war, and the other is calling for the end of this government. So kind of how to group those 3 together is kind of where three factors of the opposition now stand. I think the significant single issue which divides Netanyahu supporters from those against is that the critique that Netanyahu is unprepared to talk about the day after, something I alluded to earlier, that a lot of people understand that beyond the military campaign, there needs to be some form of political process then put in place. And for a lot of people, the Palestinian Authority, which has plenty of problems and faults and deficiencies of its own, is for many people the only game in town. And the understanding is that alongside Israel's regional partners, primarily the Egyptians and the Jordanians, the Emiratis as well, have a vested interest in that political process, but will see the removal of Hamas and a different Palestinian leadership being able to take control in the Gaza Strip.
Martin?
Well, is it really, Richard, is it really the removal of Hamas we're talking about here, or is it really the removal of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip?
Oh no! I'm quite sure that for the vast majority of Israelis, we are talking about the former. Even Netanyahu himself has kind of pushed up against. I mean, the hard right in Israel that is talking about resettlement of the Gaza Strip is nowhere near the consensus, even amongst Netanyahu supporters and Likud voters. And Netanyahu has made it clear that's not the agenda. And he's also even gone as far to say, it's not his agenda for the IDF to remain there on a permanent basis. He wants to, as you said before, kind of to have his cake and eat it, and kind of for the Israel to remain in control, to have this kind of amorphous vacuum there, and that's not constructive. And so the question is, who is Israelis, as the majority of them, do not want to be taking control of Gazan sewage and civil society and healthcare, education, housing, etc. That's not on the Israeli agenda. So there needs to be the empowerment of some Palestinian leadership that fills that void eventually.
Staying with Netanyahu,
go for it, Martin.
Very, very politically aware and clued up on the sensibilities there. Tell us, if isn't it not the case that if a ceasefire is brought about by whomever, if a ceasefire is brought about, does that not mean that the momentum that Netanyahu has politically will just collapse overnight? His entire raison d'etre will just grind to a halt and he'll be out.
Possibly. I would say that I would hedge, though, and suggest, first of all, we're in a new reality, clearly, but prior to October the 7th, Netanyahu was not a militarist leader. He actually was very conservative and cautious when it came to military adventures, unlike some of his predecessors, primarily his immediate predecessor, Prime Minister Olmert, that was very kind of gung-ho, both in war and in peace. Netanyahu is not like that. There is an argument, as you suggest, which is quite possible, that Netanyahu understands that at the end of this war, there will be elections, and he will pay the price with the Israeli electorate. However, he probably looks at it another way. It's not about extending the war or continuating perpetual war for the sake of it. It's about achieving his results. He sets himself and his government very ambitious goals to completely destroy Hamas, to destroy their military capability, and to destroy them as a political power. If he was to succeed in that,
it's not working, Richard. It's not working. You can't come on and tell us that you are destroying Hamas. You're not destroying Hamas. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. How many Hamas fighters has the IDF actually killed? You don't know, do you? Because there isn't a figure.
None of us know. But I would say that according to the IDF, and here we have we have to rely on some verified sources. We've got either the IDF or Hamas, and I'd love for someone to have some form of independent assessment that kind of wades between the Hamas figures and the IDF figures. But according to what the IDF have been saying, their assessment is that 75% of Hamas fighting force as of October has now been either killed or incapacitated. We're talking about the 24 battalions that were kind of across the whole of the Gaza Strip, that they are pretty much, almost all of them, I think 22 or 23 out of 24, have lost their ability of a command and control infrastructure and leadership and command structure that they had in place. That's not to say clearly there are fighters and they're almost returned back to first principles of fighting as individual terror cells. And this is kind of what we're seeing. I give another data point that in Zaytun, in the north of Gaza, IDF soldiers were reporting that they were encountering children firing RPG rockets. Now, on one level, that attests to the fact that the main fighters are no longer there to carry out the attacks. However, that also suggests that the motivation to attack the IDF is very high if children are picking up weapons. This is the dynamic. This is the incredibly difficult dilemma of this war, that you can defeat their command and control structure, but embers of the fire remain, whether it's fighters or members of the population who are now taking up arms.